She called me on a Tuesday morning, about 3 weeks after the retirement dinner. I almost didn't pick up because I didn't recognize the number. I'm glad I did. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "this is Fiona Beaumont. I coordinated your retirement event at the Fairmont last month. I'm sorry to call out of the blue like this. I need you to know I went back and forth about whether to do this at all." She paused. "I recorded something that night. Something you need to hear. Could you come in? Alone, please. Don't mention this to your daughter." I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after she hung up. "My name is Douglas." No, wait. I need to stop and think about how to tell this properly, because it still doesn't feel real, even now. My name is Bernard Caldwell. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a project manager with a civil engineering firm in Ottawa, and I retired last November with a pension, a decent RRSP, and what I believed was the love of my family. I believed that wholeheartedly. That's the part that still stings. My wife, Irene, passed 6 years ago. Ovarian cancer. Very fast. One of those diagnoses where you still think there's time and then suddenly there isn't. We had 2 children. My son, Marcus. No, I have to keep reminding myself. My son's name is Patrick. My daughter's name is Adrian. I always used to say they were proof that Irene and I did something right. She would have laughed at me for saying that. She was more clear-eyed about people than I ever was, including our own kids. Patrick is 38. He moved back in with me 3 years ago after his marriage fell apart. I told him he could stay as long as he needed to get back on his feet. I thought 3 or 4 months, maybe 6 at the outside. He was still there when I retired. He'd been doing some freelance IT work, he said. Sporadic contracts, nothing steady. He drove a newer truck than I did. I didn't ask where the money came from. I should have. Adrian is 35. She's been engaged to a man named Trevor for the past 1.5 years. Trevor works in real estate, not selling it, some kind of investor or developer. I was never entirely sure what he actually did. He had a way of talking that made everything sound impressive and vague at the same time. He called me Bernard, sir, the first time we met, and I thought it was charming. I stopped thinking that eventually, but I couldn't have told you exactly when. The retirement dinner was Adrian's idea. She said she wanted to celebrate me properly. She found the venue, organized the guest list, handled the catering. I offered to pay for it, and she said absolutely not. This was her gift to me. I was touched. There were maybe 40 people there. Old colleagues, a few neighbors, some family friends going back decades. My brother Raymond came up from Kingston. It was a good night. I remember standing in the middle of it all, feeling genuinely happy, thinking Irene would have loved this. I had no idea what was being said in the room next door. Fiona Beaumont worked out of a small events coordination office on Elgin Street. I met her there on the Thursday, 2 days after her call. She was in her late 40s, I'd guess, professional, clearly uncomfortable. There was a glass of water on the desk in front of me that I never touched. She told me she'd been doing a walkthrough of the venue late in the evening, near the end of the event, making sure everything was winding down properly. The bridal suite adjoining the main hall was supposed to be empty. She'd heard voices and opened the door a crack to make sure nothing was wrong. Her phone was in her hand. She'd been texting her assistant, and it started recording accidentally before she realized what was happening. She turned her laptop toward me and pressed play. It took me about 10 seconds to recognize Adrian's voice, another 5 to recognize Trevor's. There was a third voice I didn't place at first. It was Patrick. What I heard was not an argument. It wasn't impulsive or emotional. It was a conversation between 3 adults who had clearly had this conversation before and were now moving into the next stage of it. They were talking about me. Adrian was explaining that the timing was right. With me retired, she said, I'd have more time on my hands, and I'd be more willing to hand over management of my investments to someone who actually understands money. She meant Trevor. They were talking about getting me to sign a limited power of attorney for financial matters, framed as something to simplify my retirement planning. Trevor said he'd had a lawyer draft a document that was, as he put it, broad but not immediately alarming. He seemed pleased with that phrasing. Patrick's role, apparently, was to keep me feeling comfortable and not isolated. He was living in my house specifically so I wouldn't start relying on friends or my brother for advice. He'd been discouraging me, subtly, from spending too much time with Raymond. I thought back and realized that yes, every time Raymond had come up in conversation over the past year, Patrick had found something lukewarm to say. I'd thought he was just being honest. Adrian said something near the end that I've thought about many times since. She said, "He trusts me. He's always trusted me more than anyone. That's not a problem. That's the whole point." Fiona Beaumont stopped the recording. She looked at me and said nothing. I don't know how long I sat there. The office had one of those frosted glass windows that face onto the street, and I watched the blurred shapes of people walking past outside. I was thinking about Irene. Specifically, I was thinking about a conversation we had once when the kids were teenagers, when she said she worried sometimes that we'd made things too easy for them. I told her she was being too hard on herself. I told her she was being too hard on herself. I told her they were good kids. I asked Fiona if she could send me the recording. She already had it ready on a USB drive. She slid it across the desk. She said she was sorry. She said she'd almost not called, that she'd told herself it wasn't her business, that maybe she'd misunderstood. But she said she kept thinking about what it would feel like to be in my position and not know. I thanked her. I drove home. Patrick's truck was in the driveway. I sat in my car in the street for a few minutes before going inside. I need to say something here about what I did not do, because it matters. I did not go inside and confront anyone. I did not call Adrian. I did not call Raymond, which was my first instinct. I didn't sleep much that night, and the night after that wasn't much better, but I did not act from emotion. That was one of the few decisions I made in those weeks that I am genuinely proud of. What I did instead was call my accountant, George Papadakis. I worked with George for nearly 20 years. He's careful, methodical, and not easily rattled. I asked him to come to a coffee meeting, and I told him I needed to understand exactly what my financial exposure was if someone had a power of attorney over my accounts. He looked at me for a moment and then said quietly, "Bernard, has someone approached you about something like this?" I told him not yet, but I believed they were about to. George referred me to an estate lawyer, a woman named Catherine Osei, who practiced out of a firm on Bank Street. I met with her the following week. I told her everything, the recording, what was discussed, what I suspected the document Trevor had prepared would say. Catherine listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You were right to come in before anything was signed. Let's make sure there's nothing to sign." Over the next 3 weeks, Catherine and George helped me do the following. We restructured my RRSP beneficiary designations so that they no longer defaulted to my estate. This closed a door I hadn't realized was open. We set up a formal family trust for the portion of my assets I intended to eventually pass on, with an independent trustee through the law firm, not a family member. We reviewed and updated my will, which had been written when Irene was alive and hadn't been touched since. Catherine pointed out 3 places in the old document where ambiguous language could have been leveraged. We tightened all of it. Most importantly, I did not give anyone a power of attorney. When Adrian came to me 2 weeks later with what she described as just a simple form to make things easier in case anything ever happens, I told her calmly that I had already spoken to my lawyer about my estate planning and everything was in order. She smiled and said that was great, that she was relieved, and changed the subject. I watched her face carefully. She was good. I'll give her that. Trevor came for dinner the following Sunday. He brought a bottle of wine and talked about the Ottawa real estate market for the better part of an hour. At some point during dessert, he mentioned, very casually, that he knew a financial planner who worked specifically with retirees, and that it might be worth a conversation. I said I was happy with my current arrangements. He let it go. I watched that too. Patrick was trickier because he was living in my house. I want to be fair here. I don't know how much Patrick was a willing architect of this and how much he was going along with his sister and her partner. The recording didn't fully answer that question. What I know is that he was participating, that he had been deliberately managing my social life to isolate me, and that he had accepted a role in something that was designed to take advantage of me. Those are facts. What was in his heart, I genuinely don't know. About 6 weeks after I met with Fiona, I sat down with Patrick at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning. I made coffee. I told him I loved him and that I was glad we'd had this time together. I told him I was also aware that things had been difficult for him financially and that I wanted to help him get fully independent. I told him I would help him with first and last month's rent on an apartment and 2 months of living expenses, a genuine gift with no strings, and that I thought it was time for him to start building his own life again. I gave him a move-out date, 8 weeks away. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Did Adrian say something to you?" That told me more than anything he could have said intentionally. I told him this had nothing to do with Adrian. I told him the decision was mine, and it was final, and I hoped we could part on good terms. He moved out 6 weeks later, a little ahead of schedule. We haven't talked much since. He sent me a text on my birthday in March. I replied, "I don't know what the future looks like for that relationship. I'm not closing the door, but I'm not waiting at it either." Adrian was harder. She still is. I want to be honest about this part because I think people who hear stories like this sometimes expect the ending to be clean. The villain is exposed, the family is shattered, everyone gets what they deserve, and the person telling the story rides off into some serene sunset of having been vindicated. It doesn't work that way. Adrian is still my daughter. She's still the little girl I drove to figure skating at 6 in the morning for 4 years. She's still the person who sat with me every day for the last week of Irene's life. Whatever she became or decided to become in the years since, that's all still true, too. I did not tell her that I knew. I've thought a lot about whether that was the right choice. Catherine and George both advised against any kind of direct confrontation, partly for legal reasons related to the recording, and partly because, as Catherine put it, there's nothing to be gained by a conversation that has no good outcome. I don't entirely agree with that, but I followed the advice. What I did instead was change the nature of my relationship with her in ways that I controlled. I stopped being the person she could call with a financial question and expect an answer from. I started being more present with my own friends and with Raymond, who I called and had a long overdue, honest conversation with. I'm not sure I told him everything, but I told him enough that he understood why I was reaching out more. Raymond is not the type to ask questions. He just said, "About time, Bernard," and invited me to come stay for a week in the summer. I went. I spent a week in Kingston in July, sitting on Raymond's back porch in the evenings, watching the water. We talked about our father and about growing up and about what getting older feels like from the inside. It was the best week I'd had in years. Adrian and Trevor's engagement is still on. The wedding is planned for next September in Kelowna. I've been invited, and I will go, because she is my daughter, and I will not let what happened destroy every remaining thing. But I will go with my eyes open. I will go as myself, not as the version of me she was counting on, the grieving widower, the trusting father, the man who just wanted his children to be happy and would hand over everything to make it so. That man still exists. I haven't gotten rid of him entirely, and I'm not sure I'd want to. But he has a lawyer now. He has a family trust with an independent trustee. He has a brother he talks to every week on the phone, and he has a USB drive in the bottom drawer of his desk that he hopes he never needs to use but is not going to throw away. I've been asked since this happened whether I feel angry. The honest answer is sometimes, mostly early in the morning when I wake up too early and the house is quiet and I think about the retirement dinner, about standing in the middle of all those people who care about me, and knowing that 30 feet away, my daughter was talking about me like I was a problem to be managed. That feeling doesn't go away completely. I don't think it's supposed to. But I also feel something that I didn't expect, which is a kind of steadiness. I know things now that I didn't know before. I know who was in that room and what they were willing to do and what they decided I was worth. I know what my actual estate looks like and what my actual legal situation is. I know who my brother is to me. I know what Fiona Beaumont risked to make a phone call to a stranger because she thought it was the right thing to do. I sent her a thank you note a few months after our meeting, handwritten, on proper notepaper, the way my mother would have insisted on. I told her I wasn't sure I could explain what her call had meant, but that I was grateful she made it. She wrote back a short note that said she was glad and that she hoped things had worked out. They have, not perfectly, not the way I would have chosen, but they have worked out in the sense that matters most, which is that I am still here, still myself, still in possession of the life I built over 31 years of work and 40 years of marriage and 64 years of trying to be a decent person. Nobody's getting that from me, not without my knowing, not without my choosing. I smiled the first time I walked out of Catherine's office with the new documents signed and witnessed and properly filed. I smiled again when I drove home past the Fairmont on Redditstory Street and looked at the entrance and thought about Fiona and her accidental recording and the strange, unlikely grace of strangers. Some gifts come in ways you don't expect. This one came on a Tuesday morning with a phone call I almost didn't answer. I'm glad I picked up. I still think about that glass of water on Fiona's desk, the one I never touched. There's something about that detail that stays with me, sitting across from a stranger who owed me nothing, who had gone back and forth about whether to call at all, and realizing that the kindness of someone completely outside my family had done more to protect me than 35 years of loving my own children. That's not a comfortable thing to sit with. I don't pretend it is. What I've come to understand, slowly and not without some grief, is that what happened to me didn't happen all at once. It built over years, in the space between small decisions. Every time I said yes when I should have asked a question, every time I let something slide because I didn't want to make things uncomfortable, every time I chose to believe the version of my kids that made me feel like a good father rather than the version that was standing right in front of me. Those weren't failures of love. They were failures of honesty, with them and with myself. Adrienne didn't become someone who could sit in a bridal suite and discuss her father like a financial asset overnight. That took time, and I played a part in it, not by being cruel or neglectful, but by being so determined to keep the peace that I never asked her to be accountable for anything. There's a cost to that kind of parenting. I'm the one who paid it, but I set the terms years before the bill came due. What saved me wasn't luck, though Fiona's call felt like it at the time. What saved me was that I didn't act from emotion when I had every right to. I sat in my car outside my own house, and I chose to think before I moved. I called George. I called Catherine. I gathered information before I gathered my feelings. That's harder than it sounds when your chest is tight and your hands aren't quite steady, and everything you thought you knew about your family has just shifted underneath you. But it mattered. That clear-headedness, that refusal to let the worst moment make the biggest decisions, that was the thing that actually protected me. And then I had to find the will to act on what I knew, not to confront it in anger, not to blow the whole thing apart, but to quietly, methodically, close every door they've been planning to walk through. That required a different kind of strength than I expected. It wasn't the strength of a dramatic scene. It was the strength of showing up at a lawyer's office and signing documents and not saying a word to anyone about it. It was the strength of sitting across from Patrick at the kitchen table and speaking calmly when what I actually felt was something much harder to name. I think about the week I spent in Kingston with Raymond in July, sitting on his back porch in the evenings, watching the water go by. Nothing dramatic about it, just two brothers getting older together, talking about our father, talking about what matters. That week cost me nothing except the willingness to pick up the phone and ask for it. I'd been not asking for years. The things that are worth keeping rarely announce themselves loudly. Fiona didn't know what she was doing when she made that call. Raymond didn't know what he was giving me when he said, "About time." Even Catherine, when she slid those signed documents across the desk, she was just doing her job. But all of it added up to something I hadn't had in a long time. A life that was actually mine again.